Hi, everyone. I'm Don Moynihan. I'm a professor at Georgetown University at the McCourt School of Public Policy. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. We have a great conversation lined up for you. This is part of a series of conversations about the role of administrative burdens in public policy in the United States. So I'm hoping over the next hour, we will have not just a great conversation, but we'll also have an opportunity to hear from you. If you are looking at your screen, you should see a Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and all panelists will be able to see the questions that you write down. And so we will pull some of those questions towards the end of the discussion to give you an opportunity to weigh in as well. But I'm going to move quickly to talk about the topic of today's conversation, which is about immigration. And I think for most of us, we at the start of the Trump administration, paid some attention to the fact that there was this Muslim travel ban that seemed to go away and then come back again. Then at various points in time, there was a caravan. There was obviously child separation as a policy. So it's a policy area that was very important for Trump as a candidate, reappeared in the news multiple times. But I think for most of us, we don't really know the nuts and bolts of what happened over the last couple of years. And there's an argument to be made that Trump actually did a tremendous amount in terms of achieving his policy goals and restricting immigration without ever passing a single piece of legislation, largely through the use of executive power that most of the public was not paying a lot of attention to. So I brought two people to talk with us today whose writing I've really been paying a lot of attention to and enjoying on this topic over the last couple of years. And that's Sarah Stillman, who is a staff writer for the New Yorker. She's also the director of the Global Migration Program at Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism. She's won multiple awards for her journalism and is a McCarter Fellow from 2016. She does tremendous investigative writing on the topic, I would say, of public policy and policy implementation that I've used in my class many times. And I noticed one of her pieces on civil forfeiture was cited by Justice Thomas in the Supreme Court decision, which is an impressive achievement. And we also have Catherine Rampell, who is an opinion columnist at the Washington Post. She covers economics, public policy, immigration, and politics. She's also an economic and political commentator for CNN and special correspondent for PBS NewsHour and contributor to Marketplace. While she's framed as an opinion columnist, I think of her as really someone who does investigative reporting and turns it around in a very quick fashion and provides the sort of information that you don't normally see in opinion columns in terms of providing really under-hood estimates of what's happening in government. So both of these writers have been, I think, instrumental in helping me understand what's been happening in this policy area in the last couple of years. And so I've asked them to start with a sort of an opening statement of 5 minutes or less of what they found to be the main takeaway in terms of big changes in this policy area. And I'm going to start, if I will, with Catherine, and then we'll have Sarah jump in next. So this is the obligatory "you're on mute" comment.
You're right. I'm sorry. I was just saying, thanks for having me. This is one of my favorite topics, and I rely heavily on your and Pam's work, Don, about administrative burden as a lens in looking at this question of how the administration has so successfully curbed immigration, particularly legal immigration. I thought maybe I would start by talking about a few misconceptions about what immigration policy and politics have looked like over the past 4 years. So the first one is that there was, in fact, no broad groundswell of the anti-immigrant sentiment in the years leading up to Trump's 2016 campaign, nor was there in the years since. There is obviously a very vocal minority of Americans that expresses a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment, xenophobia, but they are a minority. And in fact, if you look at the polling data, Americans have become more pro-immigrant. In fact, they have reached record levels of xenophilia, I guess, as opposed to xenophobia since Trump took office. And there are some questions about why, but those trends basically predate this president. So what he has done is not, in fact, a response to mass public demand to restrict entry of foreigners into this country. The second misconception is that Trump has always really cared about this issue and wanted it to be his signature issue. In fact, when he first ran for office, he had so much difficulty even remembering to talk about immigration that his advisors came up with the mnemonic device of build the wall as a way to remind him to talk about it. They thought that making him an immigration hardliner would help him stand out in the crowded 2016 primary field. And so they figured Trump is a builder. This is going to appeal to his ego. He'll want to talk about building a wall. So he did. It got huge applause lines, of course, at his rallies. And he responded to that feedback and sort of fell in hate with immigration, I would say, and made it, obviously a fundamental part of his agenda, and then joined forces with some actually more policy-minded people who had been working for years on this issue of restricting immigration. And then third, the kind of immigration that Trump usually claims that he cares about, that is unauthorized or unlawful immigration, people coming into this country or staying here without permission, that had sort of been a solution in search of a problem. If you look at the trends in unauthorized immigration predating Trump, it had actually been falling. There had been greater out-migration than in-migration. So on net, the population of unauthorized immigrants had been falling in the years before Trump took office, basically since the housing bubble burst. So this is just sort of the context for helping us think about, how is it that immigration became Trump's signature issue, and in fact, I would argue his most enduring legacy, because I think that's essentially what we have seen here. And then the final misperception, I think, about this issue is that Trump and Miller, Stephen Miller, and other allies in the administration who have been pursuing these anti-immigrant policies, the perception is that they have mostly been going after unauthorized immigrants, whether through separating families or, ramping up deportations or what have you. And yes, they have done some particularly horrific things to the undocumented population. But the bigger impact overall on the immigration system from this administration, I would argue, has been on the legal immigration system. That is the process by which people apply for visas and work permits and permission to come here, permission to stay here with any sort of security. That has been a much more active area of policy changes for this administration. Hundreds of mostly small bore policy changes have been enacted, as you point out, entirely through administrative action of various kinds, not through changes to the law. And I forget exactly who had first proposed this construction to me, but basically, rather than going after so-called illegal immigration, Trump has just essentially tried to make all forms of immigration illegal. And he has done that through this, what I and others have referred to as a paper wall of sorts, that it's not the steel wall on the border that has had the primary impact. It's these more minute changes to the immigration system, changing how we define who is considered a so-called meritorious immigrant, setting traps for people so that they fill out their paperwork incorrectly, slowing down the machinery of government so that that paperwork, even when it is filled out correctly, gets processed more slowly and people lose eligibility as a result, or they give up, or things fall through the cracks. I like to think of it as, if Kafka could design an immigration system, it would look a lot like the one that this administration has built over the past few years. And that's even considering the fact that the immigration system was a really Byzantine, complicated, dysfunctional thing even before Trump took office.
I can attest to that. I was an immigrant myself. And so, I've gone through the paperwork, and I remember at one point having this stack of paperwork and thinking, I have a PhD in public administration and I don't know what's going on. So how is anyone else going to be able to figure this out? So Sarah, over to you. What are you sort of seeing in the investigative reporting that you've been doing on this topic?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you so much for convening us, and thanks to everyone who's listening and engaging in this conversation. I think we're among like my people, given that you're here at 2:30 to talk about the intricacies of the decimation of US asylum law. I think it's really, really hard to maintain people's degree of attention on something that has been, in some respects, such a flagrant assault from the very beginning, as Catherine described, of the kind of campaign rhetoric of build the wall. But I think it's easy to talk about and write about the big ticket, grandiose things that Trump did, family separations. People can morally understand the power of that in a very, very visceral way. But it's really hard to write about the human dimensions of how like intricate small bore tinkering with the asylum system, the stuff that Stephen Miller and this whole administration has been actually incredibly good at, in all the ways Catherine just illuminated, and in all the ways you've written about, Don, in the context of administrative burdens. I think it can be hard to sustain our attention on that. So I just wanted to start by acknowledging appreciation for everyone on the call who's taking the time to really think these things through. I think I'll start by noting that my interest in this issue really began at the tail end of the Obama administration. I think it's helpful to remind ourselves that while this issue has become so deeply partisan in the context of the Trump administration, we really saw this increase in the number of Central American asylum seekers at the border really at the tail end of Obama's time. And I became interested when I was noticing a lot of rhetoric on the Hill about how we could potentially be deporting people to their deaths. And my journalistic alarm bells went off anytime you hear something consistently said, but you don't see the names and the faces put to that. And so I actually started a little investigative team where I was teaching at Columbia, running the Global Migration Project. And we set about, at the tail end of the Obama administration, to create a database of people who had in fact been deported to their deaths, people who had come here often seeking asylum. So many of the things that Trump has effectuated were really already quite ambiguous in the realm of asylum law when it came to, for instance, people who had fled gang violence, people who had fled gender-based violence in Central America and come here seeking safety and sanctuary. But then, of course, when Trump was elected, this database of deportations to harm felt even more urgent. And we started tracking not just cases of people who sought asylum and went back and were killed, but tracking the specific reasons, the specific changes to our asylum system that caused that to be the case. And a few things stood out. I mean, I'll admit, I feel I was a bit naive at the start of the administration, precisely because Catherine, I think, laid out really articulately why there was reason to distrust Trump's passion for this issue of really harsh immigration enforcement. And so one of my very first assignments in my immigration reporting class, the month that Trump was elected, is we created this little Trump tracker database where I said, okay, let's scan every action of immigration enforcement we can find and compare. I frankly thought the rhetoric, the very bombastic rhetoric around immigration enforcement might not necessarily show up on the ground commensurately. And what we quickly began to find is one of the real profound transformations was that, even though Trump had all this early rhetoric about deporting only bad hombres and going after like people with awful criminal convictions, we were seeing a ton of cases in which people who had come onto the radar screen under the Obama administration for maybe a minor thing that they were now kind of just in an ISIS system as a result, those people were being pulled over for minor traffic violations or other minor things and then being swiftly deported. So that was one of the first things that we noticed as a pattern in the deportation to harm cases. But then as the Trump administration progressed, the level of aggression and intricacy to which they brought to bear in terms of actually decimating asylum protections, I think is really worth spelling out in its specificity. I hope that will be a lot of what our conversation is about today. I'll just give a few small examples. I spent a lot of time, talking to asylum officers at the border, and that was always an arena where, we had people who spent their lives learning the intricacies of how to interview someone who had gone through the incredible trauma of fleeing, sexual assault, fleeing violence, and then, they were having the benefit of going through a credible fear interview to be assessed. And back then, I think the standard at 2016 was maybe 80% of people would pass that initial part of the procedure to actually get the chance at a fair hearing for their asylum case. And what we saw this administration do, and an example of a very small change that was made that had huge ramifications, was to say that instead of having trained asylum officers always doing these credible fear interviews, we would suddenly have Border Patrol agents who are part of the enforcement arm doing these interviews, people who are not trauma informed and trained in how to do this process. And we saw profound ramifications in who was being let through, even to the stage of having the chance to make their case. So I could go on and on. I mean, part of what makes this issue so complex is Catherine and I could list hundreds of those kinds of examples. But I think the last thing I'll quickly say is that one of my big takeaways in watching how all of these have managed to basically disassemble both the refugee resettlement pipeline and the asylum pipeline is that I personally think the issue is much larger if we take a big step back. I think we created this whole refugee system in the post-World War II context to kind of atone for the sins of all the Holocaust, people fleeing the Holocaust who the United States never gave refuge to, or who we actively sent back to their deaths. And I think what I've seen again and again is that interviewing asylum seekers in this era, we have this set of categories of protection that just do not fit the modern landscape of persecution and harm. And I think that that predates Trump, and that will continue into the discussion of how we really address having a fair and sound asylum and immigration system in the Biden administration era. So I'll leave it at that so we can dive into the particulars.
Yeah, so before we get into some of those specific tools, I wanted to pick up on something you both sort of hinted at, is that there's sort of a conventional wisdom with Trump, which is that he's perhaps not as bad as his own rhetoric, right? He claims credit for things he has never achieved, but this is the one policy area where the rhetoric probably doesn't live up to the reality in terms of the effects on the ground. And one assumption I have is something that I think Catherine hinted at, that Trump managed to find a community of people who knew the policy of immigration intensely well, and they were willing to fall under his banner to achieve their policy goals. And so I was wondering if perhaps either of you could talk about that. So many of us know the name Stephen Miller, but that's sort of about it. Who is that broader community that helped Trump to assemble these processes?
So I can talk a little bit about that. There was a really interesting book that came out a few months ago that was a sort of biography of Stephen Miller by Jean Guerrero. And it talks about how Miller plus Bannon plus Sessions, who when he was in the Senate, had been sort of trying to figure out who was the vehicle, who might be the presidential candidate who could serve as a vehicle for getting through a lot of these tougher immigration policies. And again, immigration policies that would emphasize restricting legal forms of immigration. And then they sort of saw Trump as their vessel and glommed onto him and kind of took control, I would argue, based on the book and based on other reporting, of the immigration agenda. And I do think there's actually a legitimate question about whether Trump even knows the extent of a lot of the especially small bore policy changes that his administration has undertaken, because some of them are just like so obscure and esoteric and boring seeming, I think by design, that they certainly don't seem like they would hold his interest. But it also means that they don't get a lot of media coverage for a lot of the reasons that Sarah was talking about. You know, it's not a sexy topic to talk about greater bureaucracy. It's a little bit hard to visualize. What does it mean to have more paperwork? and it seems innocuous in some ways to a lot of Americans. So, and I don't really, and I don't know to what extent Trump is really aware of the multitude of these kinds of policy changes. I think he pays attention to the border wall. He obviously knows about his own Muslim ban and some of these other very salient, headline grabbing policy changes. But I really think it's Miller in combination with other folks who really understood what tools were available to calibrate, like the initial USCIS director under Trump, Francis Cisna, I believe he was a longtime bureaucrat who understood the machinery quite well and could rely, had the know-how to know, what kinds of tools were available to make this a lot more difficult. So I think it's a combination of people who are really ideologically motivated, plus some limited know-how about, how the system worked. And again, as we've discussed, it was broken before. So it's not like they took a well-oiled machine and then they took a sledgehammer to it. Like, there were plenty of weak points within the system that they could prey upon to make it function even worse than it had before. Although, to be fair, I mean, a lot of, we were talking about this before the session began, a lot of the kinds of changes that they made may not have staying power because they were so sloppily implemented, and that makes them more susceptible to a court challenge. So I don't want to overstate the amount of expertise that went into, breaking more of an already broken system. But I think it was this combination of sort of like really motivated people plus some expertise in how the system worked put together, could create a lot of chaos, whether or not Trump was even aware it was happening.
And I think the part of what you're talking about, I think, reflects the degree to which the life of the immigrant is incredibly dependent upon the administration and the processes in the way that the life of the citizen is not, right? If we have a problem with Social Security or IRS, we'll still stay where we are and it'll get sorted out eventually. Whereas with the immigrant, whether you can enter the country or not, whether you can maintain some sort of legal status or not, is entirely dependent upon a set of administrative procedures that are put in front of you. And so let's get back to those procedures. Sarah, so you had said, talked about like the myriad of procedures. Is there one or two that stand out to you as being particularly egregious that had these big effects in practice?
Absolutely. There's so many, but I think the one that comes to mind that has struck me on the most emotional level in terms of the people that I've interviewed and the consequences it's had for their lives is the tremendous power that the Attorney General has exercised. I think we saw this particularly with Sessions. If you look at a case like the matter of AB, I mean, in the past, I talked to people in the end of the Obama administration who were really trying to push him to use more executive power, to use more of these Attorney General opportunities where essentially, the Department of Justice can say you were taking up the chance to revisit a case that may even be longstanding precedent and to reissue a judgment that will then become the current law of the land. And Obama didn't pursue that particularly aggressively. And then in came the Trump administration, in came Sessions, and Sessions really embraced that opportunity in quite an array of cases. But the one that really springs to mind, I believe it was June 2018, something along those lines. It was the matter of AB case. And it essentially was a case where longstanding precedent had been that, we were discussing just a moment ago, the World War II era kind of creation of the language we have around asylum. And one of the most ambiguous areas of protection there, or the one that's kind of the most plastic, depending on the interpretation of a given judge or a given administration, is the idea of, people who fled persecution because they belong to a particular social group. And what constitutes a particular social group? First of all, that's not a natural idea if you're an asylum seeker who's not familiar with how to navigate the US courts. That's not something that someone would know how to articulate their case in terms of. And so I think it makes a big difference that asylum seekers have never had the inherent right to legal representation in court. But Sessions then essentially stepped in and said, women who have fled domestic violence, people who have specifically been persecuted because by gangs, unless someone could meet a very, very high burden of showing the way in which the state had failed to protect them, they would no longer be eligible for asylum. So just last week, I was listening to the audio files of a immigration proceeding that really involved quite a number of these small changes we're talking about today, but the one that stands out is matter of AB, because this mother was describing how her husband had been murdered in Honduras. Her daughter had been then kidnapped by gangs. The husband, they believe, was murdered by a gang. That they were really afraid to turn to the police. And then the mother was describing how one of her daughters had been violently sexually assaulted by a gang, and a police officer had been sitting in the room when she was being sexually assaulted. And the immigration judge proceeds to ask, well, did the police officer who was sitting in the room, sitting on the bed while your daughter was being raped, did he actually physically touch your daughter? And the mother said, no, he was sitting there watching my daughter be raped, but he did not physically touch my daughter. And the judge essentially said, I'm sorry, it wasn't really the participation of the state because the police didn't physically touch your daughter. So that's just one example. She was specifically going through a litany of these reasons why this woman wouldn't qualify for asylum. And it essentially where the case landed was, hey, your husband would have qualified because he was murdered, but you weren't murdered, so you don't qualify. That honestly is like the outer limits of where we've landed, is that in order to be eligible for asylum, you essentially have to have been murdered. But anyways, matter of AB is just one of the Attorney General rulings that I think stands out in my mind.
That's, I think, a good example of very high level power that Sessions used as an AG. So Catherine, you've also written about really small, minor, seemingly innocuous changes, like the requirement to not forget to put in NA in forms where you're asked a question, but it's not relevant to you. And that could be the difference between whether the process accepts your form or not. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah, I think this is it's the example that I cite most frequently of policy changes that just seem to have, serve no, I don't know. There's no justification for them. There's no way that I can explain what public service this serves. So in the example that you're talking about, starting in around, I think, October of last year, the administration started saying, we will not accept forms unless every field is filled out, whether or not it applies to you. And if it doesn't apply to you, you have to write N/A or none. Even if it's fairly obvious, and it might even screw up your records if you put in N/A. So if you, for example, if you don't have a middle name, you have to put in NA. And a lot of people would think, well, then won't my records show my middle name is NA? And in fact, at least one person told me that they think that happened to their client. But there are other examples of this throughout these forms where it's like, what purpose could this possibly serve? So another example of this that was shown to me was a rejection for, I think in this case, I'm trying to remember if it was an asylum form or an application for this special crime victim visa. But basically, there's a field that says, list the names and locations of your parents and your siblings, and if they are deceased, check the box that says deceased. And in this particular application, the applicant listed their 2 parents and I think 2 siblings, all of whom were dead. Checked the box for deceased, 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 did not fill out the box for current address. Rejected, right? I mean, again, what purpose could it possibly serve to reject the form of a person who doesn't provide a current mailing address for a dead mother? There's just no justification that I can see for that. But essentially, USCIS started rolling out this policy application form by application form last fall, extending it to new kinds of visas. and they gave no notice for it. So there were cases where attorneys, for example, had mailed in an application assuming that it would be processed as it had always been processed. If you didn't have a middle name, you leave middle name blank. And then once it arrived, it was rejected without any sort of notification, because that very day, USCIS had put a little tiny footnote on its website saying, we might reject your form if there are any blanks. And so the thing gets rejected. And in the meantime, you can refile the same application, and with the correct, the corrected information, putting in N/A or none. And by the way, you have to know when you're allowed to use N/A and when you're allowed to use none, because they are apparently not interchangeable. Like, there are all these, minutia of rules that you would just have no idea existed unless you were an immigration attorney. But so you can resubmit, but in the meantime, maybe one of the derivatives on your application, a child, for example, ages out of eligibility because it takes so long for USCIS to send you back the rejected form. And at that point, the kid has turned 21 and can no longer be part of your application. So there is some enduring damage to all of this, in addition to the wasted man hours and postage and everything else that goes along with it. And beyond that, immigration attorneys eventually started noticing that this was happening and just like writing NA or none wherever they could in every possible field. There was one attorney who told me he bought a rubber stamp, a custom-made rubber stamp, so that he could stamp all over the form, because in the software, if for some of these online forms, you cannot type NA or none in fields where a number is supposed to be entered, like a date. So the software, anyway, I'm just trying to convey like how frustrating and maddening this is. But anyway, immigration attorneys eventually got wise to it, started, trying to fulfill this additional stupid requirement. And then USCIS said, okay, we're going to extend the policy to forms that are filled out by third parties that you have no control over. So an example of that might be if you're applying for one of these visas for people who are victims of serious crimes who are aiding law enforcement. There's a special visa category for you that's designed to help people who might be undocumented come forward and report crimes and participate in investigations and prosecutions and things like that. But you have to get a certification from a law enforcement official that you are doing this, that you reported a crime, that you aided in their efforts, whatever. And USCIS said, well, even on those law enforcement forms, we are going to have this requirement that there's an NA everywhere. And maybe the immigration attorneys are going to know that this idiotic step is required because they do enough volume of these things, but your local police department may not. And you don't have control over what they fill out. The same thing with a medical form. They said, well, at least I know of a few examples where doctors, medical certifications were rejected because there was an irrelevant blank. And so it's just like every single little thing that they can do to gum up the works and to make this process more difficult that doesn't seem to serve, any meaningful public function, doesn't improve the screening of the application. It's just some additional level of, red tape, busy work to slow things down and to discourage people from applying.
Yeah, one sort of takeaway point we could draw from this from a public policy perspective is that when we put new regulations on businesses, they have to go through some sort of cost benefit analysis where ultimately you have to demonstrate that this new regulation is actually worth it, right? There might be some cost, but the benefit outweighs the cost. Whereas some of the examples we're talking about, there's no functional administrative benefit beyond simply making it more difficult for people to negotiate the process. And that in itself shouldn't be a public policy goal, right?
Yeah, and in fact, that does open up a lot of these kinds of policy changes to legal vulnerability. There was a lawsuit that was filed recently over this no blanks policy, arguing that it didn't go through whatever the proper rulemaking procedure there should be to make a substantive change like this that really affects how people interact with the state and get their applications processed. So there has been plenty of formal rulemaking where they have tried to do this cost benefit analysis, sometimes sort of cooking the books, as they've done in other realms beyond immigration as well to get the numbers to add up so that they look like they're positive, that it looks like there's a net economic benefit. But in many cases, they've just ignored that legal requirement altogether, which opens them up to legal challenges.
So let's transition to talking about that topic now. So what happens from here, right? So Trump has done a tremendous amount in 4 years using executive powers, but how much of that administrative machinery will stay in place? And so we have the potential for Biden administration to do a lot on day one. There's also the potential of court challenges slowly eroding many of the policies that were put in place for various reasons. And so I'd like you both, but starting with Sarah, to speculate about what does the next 4 years look like in terms of undoing or moving in a new direction, or even what should the Biden administration be doing to sort of move in a way that's consistent with the policy signals it's made, such as announcing significant increases in the number of refugees who will be allowed to enter the US?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think this is another example where there's like multiple layers of intricacy, because I think at the top layer, the really simple stuff can be done really quickly. Like we've talked about executive action. So we saw, the quote unquote Muslim ban or the travel bans and their various iterations. And that's something that on day one, Biden could and should, and I believe will actually simply act upon and try to restore the refugee resettlement pipeline. Well, that's also an interesting example where there's been so many downstream ramifications as well of the harms that have been done to some of the kind of institutional infrastructure. Like if you take resettlement of refugees as an example, so many of the agencies that actually do the resettlement on the US side have really lost their budgets, and in some cases have just ceased to exist altogether because there has been no incoming flow of people, and their budgets have been predicated on the precise numbers they're getting. So we do have to do a lot of work to really restore even just the budgets of and capacity of those groups. But I think that's something, a lot of that could be accomplished very quickly on day one. And then you see the stuff that's in the realm of, concrete rulemaking that I think a big difference between the Biden administration and the Trump administration is that Trump was perfectly willing to grossly violate the Administrative Procedure Act. Like as Catherine mentioned, that makes a lot of what they did extremely vulnerable to lawsuits, and so much of the litigation against these Trump administration small bore policy changes has been very effectively won. I mean, we just saw just this week the DACA ruling that people had assumed that when Biden came into office, he would try to restore DACA. That's another thing that he could quickly do to restore it, and maybe even to find ways to expand it. And I think we just saw the courts act favorably to help kind of pave the way for that. And then I hadn't really thought much until I read the preview of a new book that's coming out called The End of Asylum, that really catalogs a lot of these policies. And in there, they talk about the power of this administration stepping into the existing litigation and reaching favorable settlements, that in an interesting way is actually one of the deepest and most solid ways that positive immigration changes, and specifically changes to restoring the asylum and refugee systems, could be reached. Because if you think about something like the Flores settlement, when you think about the protections that are afforded to immigrant children who are supposed to be quickly taken out of detention and placed into the least restrictive care possible, that Flores agreement was reached, I believe the litigation traces back to 1997. And so when we get a favorable legal standard that protects kids in the realm of the courts, that actually can be more effective than, for instance, an executive action, which could be quickly undone by a future administration, should there be one that has contrary views. So I think that's a really quick and effective way that the administration could make some of these changes. I think another really big and challenging thing will be how to get Biden's rhetoric around what he says he's going to do on some of this stuff to match the reality in the arenas that are most tricky, like, for instance, migrant protection protocols. People are probably familiar with this being one of the most damaging ways that asylum seekers' rights were curbed, because, with MPP, as it's called, or the Remain in Mexico program, many asylum seekers were essentially told to await their cases, await their chance to go before an immigration judge on the Mexico side of the border instead of in the US. And as many of you on this call surely know, and as many of the families I've spoken to there have clearly explained, migrants have faced sexual assault there, they've faced constant kidnappings there. It's not a safe place for people, right? And so Biden has made promises on Twitter and in his campaign platform and in the debates that he's going to quickly undo this policy. But I think the question of what that really looks like, and the tensions, I think, internal to the transition team about what that looks like in practice amidst the pandemic is really critical. Because I guess the last really quick thing I'll flag is that we haven't touched on this yet, but there have been upwards of 55 different small bore policies related to the pandemic that I think have essentially used COVID-19 as a pretext for further harming asylum seekers' rights. And hundreds of thousands of people have been shut out of the country on those particular grounds. So I think that's something that Biden will have to work hard to change in a way that feels realistic to the constraints of the pandemic, but that doesn't use it as a pretext to violate the law.
Yeah, it is ironic that immigration is one area where Trump administration has been particularly concerned about the effects of the pandemic relative to other parts of the administration. Catherine, what are your sort of takeaways or suggestions for what could or should happen in the next 4 years?
So I agree with Sarah that the things that were done via, presidential proclamation or executive order or similar can be undone relatively quickly, even if some of them may have some, like more mechanical challenges for how do you undo them. The real difficulty will be in the formal regulatory space. So actually a lot of the kinds of things that had been implemented through a policy memo, like the matter of AB that Sarah was talking about earlier, have been or are in the process of being codified into formal regulations, which is, most people don't pay attention necessarily to what this means, but it's just a much more cumbersome process. It requires going through a notice and comment period, both to put the regulation in place and to come up with a new regulation. You can't just say like, we think that was a mistake that this regulation was put in place. You have to open up this whole new process and accept comments, respond to all of the comments, et cetera. And that it just takes a long time. It can take years before a new regulation is put in place. The Trump administration, of course, cut corners and didn't necessarily, abide by the letter of the law, the Administrative Procedure Act that we've been talking about, which has made it more vulnerable to court challenges. But you could imagine that a Biden administration would be a little more by the book, which has its pros and cons, right? Like you want them to be following the law, but on the other hand, it means that the process of rescinding these regulations will probably be a little bit slower than the process of putting them into place, unless a court strikes them down. And I don't know that a Biden administration will prioritize undoing all of the damage to the immigration system, investing all of the political capital necessary that the Trump administration did. It was, one of Trump's, if not his number one issue, one of his top issues. And Biden has a lot of other fires to put out right now. So I think there's some question about how much they'll invest in all of that, or at least how quickly that can get done. And then there's this issue of what do you do with this huge backlog of people who are in this Remain in Mexico, MPP program. If you suddenly get rid of the program, you could have a system that's overwhelmed, right? Because you've been metering the number of people who, even before the pandemic, could apply for asylum, could begin that process of applying and have their initial interview, et cetera. So I think there are going to be some again, logistical challenges there. And then there are other issues, that are not strictly within like the regulatory policymaking space, like USCIS is broke because it turns out it costs a lot more money to harass immigrants than to just straightforwardly process their applications. So in previous years, USCIS, which is almost 100% fee funded, that is, they don't get much in the way of federal appropriations, they collect fees on the immigration forms that they receive. They've been facing budget shortfalls and they're in a hiring freeze. And I don't know how difficult it will be for Biden to correct, the fact that as an institution, it's really in trouble. Morale is bad there too, in part because people who joined USCIS, as differentiated from the people who joined ICE, they might have joined it because it was seen as a government agency that, as its name suggests, provides services to immigrants. So there's been some brain drain there. The kinds of people who have joined they've doubled the number of people who are working in anti-fraud type work. So like, how do you fix the institutions? You can change the policies, but I think the culture has somewhat changed there. Again, they're in this hiring freeze. I don't know what the funding issue, what kind of funding mechanisms they really have at this point to fix that. There have been some things that Congress has allowed them to do to raise additional money, but they've been slow walking it. So, there's some of this other, harder to quantify enduring damage that will persist even if Biden just decides to reverse every single actual policy change that his predecessor put in place.
So let me pick up on that last point really quickly, because with two of the questions that were asked in the Q&A were specifically about this issue of how much bureaucrats agreed with some of these policies, and it might vary between specific agencies like USCIS versus ICE, for example. But let's say there's a cadre of people, especially at the front lines, who are receptive to the message that Trump has proposed, and now you're the new head of DHS, and you're trying to convey a new message. What does that involve? Do we need to retrain people? I mean, one of the things we talk about when we teach our students at Georgetown is just how hard it is to change organizational cultures, how sticky cultures are, and once cultural norms are embedded, it's really hard to unwind them. So to me, that seems like one of those potentially long-lasting issues that might outlast the Biden administration. Do you have any magic wand or solution to wave in that direction?
I'm so glad that topic came up. It's been on my mind and something I had meant to list in terms of the profound changes that are a lot harder to effectuate because they can't just be done through even a cumbersome regulation. The depth of culture change that is needed. I'm thinking in particular about a case that comes to mind of a woman named Camila that I've been reporting on. She was a transgender asylum seeker from El Salvador. And when she came here seeking asylum, she was deported and then killed after her deportation. And initially there was a lot of kind of brief publicity about her case, and people assumed that she'd been rejected by the immigration court for all the reasons that we've been discussing on this call. And so I was actually really surprised when I obtained the audio file of her immigration proceedings. And what had actually happened was that as a transgender asylum seeker, Camila had been, although she identified as a woman, she'd been placed in a male facility. And there she had been every day basically harassed and subject to very, very cruel a really, really cruel institutional culture of detention, of immigration detention. And that it had gotten so horrible for her that she said to the judge, look, like, I cannot survive like this, just send me back. And she was killed soon thereafter. And it really made me reflect on how, I mean, certainly I'm not under the impression that that simply started under the Trump administration, our culture of cruelty and detention. But I think we saw explicitly this administration embrace a rhetoric of cruelty that, I think we could fall into the false binary of saying, oh, here's Trump's rhetoric on the one hand, the stuff he's just saying, and then the stuff he's actually doing. But I've come to believe that the rhetoric side of things, when it comes to immigration enforcement, has profound repercussions, including like the ones I just mentioned in Camila's life that led to her death. So I think we're going to need to really think about what does it mean to retrain Border Patrol officers and ICE detention officers about how they do their jobs ethically, and then how do we enforce what the moral norms are within those institutions.
Can I sort of jump on to that question, because there's another question that's related to it by Ginger, who asked about essentially external oversight by Department of Justice or Congress of what's been happening under ICE, partly because it does sort of feel like this has been a black hole in terms of the administration. We don't know a lot about the day-to-day of what's happening. We've seen members of Congress go to sites and being told they couldn't enter in some cases, for example. And so this is another vehicle to shine a light on what's happening. Do you, maybe I'll pose this to you, Catherine, see a potential for benefits out of a big congressional investigation or something that might be akin to a blue ribbon commission to really unwind what's happened over the last 4 years?
It certainly couldn't hurt. And to be fair, there have been congressional attempts to do some sort of audits of, for example, the family separation policy. I mean, a lot of the information that we have about what happened to these families and the enduring trauma that they still experience. A lot of it's because of investigative journalists, but quite a bit of it is from, I think it was some House Oversight Committee report. I'm trying to remember which, I don't remember the name of the committee, I'm going to bungle it, but in any event, that came out a couple of months ago. So there has been there have been efforts on this realm. Of course, the Trump administration has not been particularly cooperative, and one would hope that a Biden administration, as part of its remit to kind of repair the damage that has been done over the past few years, and again, as we keep on saying, the damage that the dysfunctionality that predates Trump, would be more open to oversight and some sort of broader reckoning about how these agencies function. But again, it remains to be seen, what the best way to make sure that oversight happens. And I don't know exactly what the relationship of Congress to ICE and CBP are. I know that I've talked with folks who on the Hill who are involved in USCIS oversight, and it is, as I understand it, somewhat limited by the fact that they are not an appropriated agency. And so, there's a relationship, but the relevant committee doesn't really have the same carrot and stick kind of tools that they would have with other agencies because they're fee funded. Now, again, they're broke. So USCIS under any administration, but maybe perhaps particularly a Biden administration, would be more receptive to, listening to feedback from people on the Hill. But yeah, I think that there is a tremendous reckoning that needs to happen before the country can move on. And especially with some of the really egregious cruelties that maybe the public is aware of, like family separations. And one of my great concerns is that as a country, we will want to move on from this national stain and put it in the rearview mirror and just say, look, the bad thing happened. It's not happening anymore, although technically it still sort of is. And let's move on. And there needs to be some more exhaustive commission of some kind that looks at how were these things allowed to happen? How do we prevent them from happening again? And how do we do right by the many victims of the things that did happen and that are continuing to go on?
Can I stay with you 1 minute, Catherine, for a quick response to another question, because I know you've written about this, which is how students have been affected by many of the same processes. And so these are not refugees, these are not the migrant caravans, but they've also encountered the same sort of difficulties and administrative burdens when trying to come to places like Georgetown or other universities in the US as well. So can you sort of briefly mention a couple of those tactics that they've seen as well?
Sure. So as I mentioned before, a lot of the policies that will have enduring damage, or that have maybe gone under the radar and have gotten less attention relative to their impact, I'll put it that way, are ones that affect people who are trying to come here legally, including international students who, by the way, are a great blessing to this country, economically, culturally, and otherwise. If all you care about is the trade deficit, for example, this is like one of our most successful exports. Higher education is considered an export since it's being sold to international people. In any event, despite Trump's normal stated concern for, reducing trade deficits and allowing people to come in here the right way, et cetera, whatever that means, his administration, at the very least, has put in place a number of policy measures that have made it much more difficult for students to come here. For example, during COVID, there was this back and forth about whether international students whose coursework had gone online would be able to come here. There was a lawsuit. A lot of the news coverage, I think, kind of got the resolution of that lawsuit wrong. What happened was a number of schools led by Harvard and MIT, and I think, 100 other schools maybe joined, sued the administration, said, we need to be able to allow these students to come here. It's a pandemic. We can't guarantee that classwork will be in person. The reporting was that the administration backed down. In fact, what it did was it said, if you have an existing student visa and your coursework goes online, you can stay, but they would not issue new visas to newly enrolled students. So if you look at the numbers, I think the last I had looked at this, international student visas had plummeted like 70% year over year. And then there's another rule that's currently in the works that would basically change how long these student visas are good for, even after the pandemic. So historically, it's been that your visa is valid for as long as your course of study is ongoing. If you're a PhD student and your coursework takes 6 years, you can stay here on that visa for 6 years. The administration is saying, no, we're going to limit it to 4 years for most people, regardless of what program you're in, and 2 years from people who are from countries that they consider bad actors. There are a bunch of visa overstays, which are predominantly African countries, as it turns out. And there's a lot of ambiguity or uncertainty about whether you could get a renewal for that visa, and if you can't, because the way that the draft proposal is written, it's not clear if you can. That basically eliminates almost all or destroys almost all American STEM PhD programs, which historically take 6 years or more and have a predominantly international student base. And, one of the things we've been talking about is how difficult it'll be to undo the damage. This rule, to my knowledge, is not yet finalized, but in some ways, it almost doesn't matter. Like, even if it doesn't get finalized, even if the Biden administration decides they're not going to go through with this rule, or they're going to go through the process of rescinding it, the reputational cost to the United States is huge, because for years, again, America has been a very desirable destination for the world's talent, both students and high-skilled workers, amongst other immigrant populations. And these poor students, I'm sure some of them are tuning into this, some of them might be your students, have just been jerked around so much as a result of the two policies that I mentioned, amongst others, that, I would understand if they decide not to go to the United States, they go to a place like Canada, which has taken advantage of our cruelty/incompetence when it comes to this issue and has been aggressively recruiting international students. Australia has been doing the same thing, to some extent China. So, even if the policy gets corrected, I think there's going to be a potentially large, enduring loss in terms of the attractiveness of the United States as a destination for global talent who do have other options for places to study or for places to work.
Yeah, and I think this has been one of the themes from our discussion today, is that you can't put the toothpaste back in the tube with some of these things. And once you've broken something, it takes a long time to fix it, or it might not be fixable, right? And in the case of higher education, you're talking about the reputation of a sector where someone might decide, well, I understand Trump is not president now, but do I really want to bet 6 years of my life in a setting where it could go back to this very constrictive approach to visas? So we are almost at time. Sarah, I'm going to sort of leave the last question to you. And it's something that Catherine mentioned as well, which is that certain countries, in particular countries in Africa, have gotten a sort of a higher level of scrutiny. And so Jenny asked a question about targeting particular racial groups and whether there's any path to sue for discrimination. And one thing I've noticed over the last couple of weeks is that we've seen reports of efforts to speed up deportations of in particular migrants who have been coming from Africa, who have what on paper looks like fairly credible claims of refugee status. But according to immigration lawyers, they are getting turned down at a much higher rate and then are also being prioritized for deportation. And so I don't know what potential legal path there is to invoke race, but is there a racial element to some of the patterns that we're seeing when it comes to the implementation of these policies?
I think there is without a doubt a set of racial patterns and racist patterns that we've seen in this Trump administration's enforcement and even in the way that they've crafted these laws. I mean, I think that that was on very, very clear display in the crafting of the very first executive orders, including the travel ban. And I think that was one of the ways in which the ban's evolution is actually illustrates why this is complex, right? Because the first ban was overturned precisely because Trump was so blatant about his racism. And I think that's one liability that he's had in the legal context is that he doesn't even try to hide it. And so even things that he'd put out on Twitter and statements that he'd made specifically vilifying Muslims and people from Muslim majority countries then had ramifications in court, right? But I think what's really interesting about that example is that we then saw further iterations of the ban that were a little bit more legally subtle, that still had really profound ramifications for people from Muslim majority countries, but that fell into an arena that made them harder to legally challenge, that were ultimately then upheld by the Supreme Court. So I think it's interesting. It kind of poses the question, what would you do with the president who was every bit as racist as Trump, but who was a little bit better at being subtle about it or using the law to effectuate it without blatantly then tweeting about it? But I think one topic that hasn't come up in terms of how some of these policies can be undone is also the question of reparations, which I think many people are fairly asking about. And I think some people are asking, could the Biden administration, for instance, in the context of people who were separated from their children at the border, could they receive reparations? And so specific to this question about discrimination, I'll just give one really quick example of a family that successfully challenged on those grounds. So I wrote about a family from Honduras that had been separated, and it was the first successful use of something called the FTCA claims, the Federal Tort Claims Act, which basically says that if you faced intentional infliction of severe emotional distress, that you could potentially win the equivalent of reparations in court. And so we do have precedent for that. And I do think that it's a really interesting thing for this administration to explore, not just how do you undo these policies, but also how do you do right by the people who suffered their most profound ramifications. You're muted.
We have to do at least one you're muted before we wrap up. We are past the hour that we promised that we'd stop at. I know we could talk for another hour or two about this topic. There really is so many details to unpack. If you're interested in this topic, I'd encourage you to follow Catherine's work in the Washington Post. I know Sarah also has a new piece coming out in the New Yorker in the coming weeks on this topic as well. They're doing tremendous work in sort of pulling back the machinery of administration and exposing it and its effects to this population that often doesn't really get covered. In the meantime, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to Sarah. Thank you to Catherine. It's really just a pleasure to have a chance to chat with you on this topic. And I hope to see you all in a virtual or real space at some point in the future. Thank you.
Thanks so much, everyone. Take care.
Thank you. Thanks.